A black woman boards her flight in silence, dressed in a tailored suit, ready to travel like anyone else, but what happens next is anything but ordinary. A powerful CEO mocks her, questions her right to sit in first class, and belittles her in front of everyone on board. But just 47 minutes later, the truth comes out, and he's not only humiliated, he's replaced by the very woman he tried to degrade. What happened next left the entire cabin in stunned silence and changed everything. Stay with me. This is a story about justice, power, and how dignity doesn't need to shout to shake the system. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. It all started with a seat and ended with a reckoning. He always walked like the world was his inheritance. Cornelius Pratt had long learned how to command a room, not with grace, not with wisdom, but with volume and posture. His empire had been built not from the soil of understanding, but from the polished floor of boardrooms where the only currency was ego. He didn't need to earn respect. He bought it. Like a tailored suit, he wore power not as protection, but as provocation. That's why first class was never a luxury to him, it was the natural order. He moved through the cabin with that self-certainty old money teaches and inherited privilege perfects. And then he stopped. She was sitting there. A black woman. Not the type who served drinks or folded coats. No, this one had a presence. She wore a navy suit, crisp as winter air. Her posture, poised. A tablet in her lap. Her fingers moved across it with a rhythm that suggested decision-making, not idleness. She wasn't occupying the seat. She belonged in it. And that infuriated him. Cornelius turned to the young blonde attendant with a flick of his wrist. "There's been a mistake," he said, already expecting the universe to correct itself. But the girl stammered, unsure. "Sir, the manifest confirms this is her seat." Her seat. He flared, nostrils wide, eyes cold. "Then move me. I'm afraid there are no available seats." Now others were listening. A murmur here, a glance there. But it wasn't their concern. Not yet. He turned to the woman, not to greet her, not to inquire, but to correct. "You're in first class." "I'm aware," she replied, without looking up. And that was her first crime. Because in Cornelius's America, black presence is only tolerated when it's accompanied by apology. He expected a flinch, a stammer, an explanation. She gave him none. He called her an upgrade. She called him fashionably ignorant. And somewhere, a chuckle rippled through the cabin like a match touching dry grass. Cornelius bristled. "Do you even know who I am?" But he didn't ask her, he asked the attendant, as though the answer could only come from someone paid to believe in him. And then, with the desperation of a man watching his illusion unravel, he reached for his only defense, mockery. He sprayed cologne in her direction, thick and deliberate. "I can't stand certain smells," he muttered. Still, she said nothing. Because silence, when chosen, is not surrender. It's a strategy. He made calls, loud and performative. Spoke of standards. Spoke of just anyone. Spoke as if she were furniture out of place. And still, she said nothing. That silence enraged him. Because when a black woman does not break beneath your insult, when she does not collapse into the role you wrote for her, she becomes dangerous. Passengers began to stir. Whispers of enough drifted from the rows. But Cornelius believed himself insulated. Untouchable. A man not governed by decency, but by dominance. He leaned in, voice like a needle. "You get a little money, a little suit, and think you belong here." She turned to him, calmly. "Be careful, Mr. Pratt. There are witnesses." He scoffed. "And what will you do? Tweet it? Call it a hate crime?" Her voice never rose. "I plan," she said, "to ignore you." That's when the drink came. Scotch. Poured slowly, lifted deliberately, and spilled, casually, onto her sleeve. He called it turbulence. She called it what it was, with her silence. That right there was the moment this story stopped being about a seat. It became a mirror. And for the first time, Cornelius Pratt began to see something he'd never seen before, not in meetings, not in mirrors, not in the eyes of trembling interns. He saw the end of his story. He just didn't know it yet. The plane rose, 35,000 feet in the air, but the real turbulence never came from the sky. It came from the man beside her. Cornelius Pratt sat fuming, not from spilled drinks, not from broken glass, but from the one thing men like him could never endure, being ignored. Alicia Munro had not flinched. Not when he questioned her presence. Not when he bathed her in mockery. Not when the scotch kissed her sleeve, and the cabin inhaled its collective gasp. That silence, it unnerved him. See, the world had taught him that black women were supposed to perform for their safety. Smile to de-escalate. Apologize for existing. Disappear politely if asked nicely enough. Alicia did none of that. And that frightened him in ways he could not name. He leaned in again, voice low like a whisper meant to bruise. You don't belong here. And deep down, you know it. Alicia didn't turn her head. She didn't even blink. Instead, she said, without raising her voice, you should enjoy the quiet, Mr. Pratt. You won't have it for long. That sentence, that soft, calm warning, landed like prophecy. Cornelius recoiled, briefly. But men like him don't retreat. They double down. Because for them, cruelty is not just an instinct, it's a strategy. He raised his voice. Spoke to no one in particular. Loud enough for the cabin to hear. First-class standards are slipping. Just letting anyone in now. No gatekeeping. No quality. The words were dressed as opinion, but sown with poison. Across the aisle, a young couple looked away. Behind them, a middle-aged man shook his head. But no one said a word. That was the second insult. Not from Cornelius, but from the silence around him. Because in America, the greatest cruelty isn't always direct. It's a shrug. It's the refusal to speak. It's the crowd that watches and decides not to intervene. One passenger, a man in his late 30s with sandy hair, finally leaned forward. That's enough. Cornelius turned, bemused. Excuse me. You're embarrassing yourself, the man said. A few murmurs of agreement rose, then fell just as fast. Cornelius smirked, leaned back. Ah, the woke police. Always watching. You people are so sensitive. An older woman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, turned from 3 rows up. That's not sensitivity, dear, she said. That's just called being decent. The cabin stirred. Not revolution, but rumble. And still, Alicia sat composed. No applause. No outburst. Just steady breath and still hands. Cornelius couldn't stand it. It was easier to fight someone shouting. But Alicia was winning without speaking. She was commanding the room without moving. So he lashed again, under his breath, but aimed like a dagger. People like you always think a little money makes you equal. This time, Alicia turned her head. She looked at him, not with rage, not with pain, but with understanding. As if she had seen this man 1,000 times before in different suits, at different tables, saying the same thing behind different smiles. Be careful, Mr. Pratt, she said. Words have consequences. And not everyone in this cabin is asleep. That's when the flight crew returned, tentative, cautious, but more alert than before. A supervisor. A co-pilot. Whispered words. Uneasy glances. Cornelius, ever the king in his crumbling kingdom, crossed his arms. Now what? Are you going to escort me out midair? The crew didn't answer. But the air did. It had shifted. It no longer bent to him. It was beginning to orbit her. Alicia Munro, who had not shouted. Who had not wept. Who had not defended her worth. She had simply waited. And the thing men like Cornelius never understood was that some storms don't rage. They rise. He called it an accident. That's what Cornelius Pratt said when the amber scotch bloomed across Alicia Munro's sleeve, staining the midnight blue of her suit like bruised silk. Turbulence, he muttered, feigning concern. Oops. But there was no shake. No jolt. Not even a whisper from the wind outside. Just intention. And arrogance. And the kind of hatred that no longer wears a hood, but a suit and a Rolex. Alicia looked down at the spreading stain. She didn't gasp. She didn't curse. She didn't cry. She simply set her tablet down and reached for a napkin. The cabin went quiet, not from respect, but from discomfort. Because that's how America often reacts when its reflection becomes too clear. It averts its gaze. The flight attendant rushed over. Apologies spilling faster than the scotch. I'm so sorry, I'll clean it right away. No need, Alicia said, calm as prayer. It's just a suit. Cornelius scoffed beside her. That's the spirit. Accidents happen. And there it was, the mask of reason hiding the snarl underneath. You see, men like Cornelius had learned long ago how to stay just beneath the line. Just subtle enough. Just quiet enough. Just polished enough to humiliate without consequence. That's what white-collar racism looks like at 35,000 feet. Not slurs, but spills. Not fists, but protocol. Not exclusion, but presence made it intolerable. He leaned in again. Lower now. Sharper. You think you're better than me? Alicia didn't look up. I think we should enjoy the flight in silence. That should have ended it. But it didn't. Because silence is only respected when it comes from power. When it comes from a black woman, it becomes a threat. So he spoke louder again. Called for another drink. Mocked her directly this time. Not behind gestures. Not behind implication. But with the full weight of a man who'd never been told no. People like you don't belong here. You never will. And this time, Alicia turned her head. Slowly, precisely. She smiled. Not the smile of forgiveness. Not the smile of tolerance. But the smile of someone who's been through worse and watched it all come undone. Cornelius felt it before he understood it. That cold slipped down his spine. That quiver in the chest that men like him confuse with intuition. It was fear. But he masked it. You're awfully quiet now, he said, forcing a chuckle. Alicia's eyes didn't blink. Because I don't argue with small men. He flinched. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the truth behind it. For the first time, the cabin responded, not with whispers, but movement. A few passengers turned. Some nodded. One or two smiled. He was losing the room and didn't even know how. He tried again. Called her dramatic. Called her entitled. Called the passengers overly sensitive. But none of it landed. Because the weapon he always wielded, shame, had bounced off the one thing he couldn't defeat, dignity with memory. Alicia Monroe didn't just survive him. She exposed him. She made him visible. Not as a CEO. Not as a man of status. But as a man afraid of losing control in a world that no longer bowed the moment he cleared his throat. And Cornelius couldn't stand it. He raised his voice one last time. Do you even know who I am? And somewhere, 2 rows behind them, a woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace answered without lifting her voice. Yes, that's what makes it sad. The cabin fell still. It was no longer a flight. It was a reckoning. And Cornelius Pratt, for the first time in his long, unchallenged life, had no idea how to land. Power, when it is threatened, begins to whisper. It no longer commands. It connives. And that is what Cornelius Pratt became in that cabin, a whispering man. A man clinging to the myths that made him. A man losing control, but too proud to admit that the control was never his to begin with. He sat back in his seat, his scotch barely touched, his jaw tight. The crowd, the first-class crowd, the polite crowd, the white crowd, was no longer with him. Their silence had cracked. It hadn't shattered, not yet. But something old and fragile had started to bend. And that bending, that quiet shift of air, made Cornelius dangerous. He wasn't a man who accepted humiliation. Not in the boardroom. Not at home. Certainly not on a flight seated beside a black woman who refused to shrink. So he did what many powerful men do when they lose the floor. He reached for the phone. "This is Cornelius Pratt," he barked loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Yes, I'm on flight 738, seated beside a problem." He glanced at Alicia, his voice syrupy with disdain. "Let's just say she's not representative of our usual clientele." There was no call. There was no one on the other end. The phone was a prop, but the performance was for the cabin. And the message was clear. "I still have power. I can still destroy you." Alicia didn't blink. She didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head. Because the thing Cornelius never understood was this. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Quietly. He hung up and smirked. They'll know soon enough. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant named Jake watched nervously. His fingers twitched. He glanced at the lead attendant. "Should we say something?" he whispered. The lead shook his head. "Don't. That's Cornelius Pratt. He's got board connections. If we cross him, we're gone." And there it was, the real lesson. Not that Cornelius was powerful, but the people around him believed he was. Believed it so deeply they would allow harm. Believed it so deeply they would abandon principle. Believed it so deeply they would protect the man, not the truth. That, my friend, is not neutral. That is complicity. Laura, the young attendant who had stood by silently since the spill, approached with a hesitant smile. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Pratt?" He leaned back like a king. "Yes, a seat upgrade. One that doesn't come with a side of attitude." Her face turned red. She said nothing. She didn't have the words. But Alicia did. Without lifting her voice, without raising her eyes, she said, "Every time you speak, Mr. Pratt, you tell yourself." He flinched. Just slightly. But enough. Because truth doesn't need a volume. It only needs an audience. He turned toward her, cold now. That kind of cold that men learn in places where being cruel feels like being in control. "You think this means something? Sitting here beside me. Talking back. You think I haven't seen your kind before?" Alicia finally looked up. "No," she said. "You've only seen reflections of yourself. Not mirrors." That was when the cabin really began to shift. Because now, passengers weren't just watching. They were choosing. One by one, eyes turned toward Alicia. Not with pity. With recognition. The older woman from earlier nodded once. The young man across the aisle pressed his lips together, a quiet vow forming behind clenched teeth. And Cornelius saw it. He saw the shift. He saw the tide. And he panicked. He called for another drink, barked an order at Laura, snapped at Jake. But none of it worked. His kingdom was shrinking. And the woman beside him wasn't moved by his rage. She was measuring it. Men like Cornelius are only powerful when unchallenged. And tonight, he'd made the fatal mistake of mistaking presence for permission. Alicia Monroe wasn't there to be tolerated. She was there to inherit what they said she could never touch. The seat. The silence. The company. And every stare that once condemned her, now quietly braced for what was coming next. Cornelius Pratt was running out of runway. Oh, not literally. The plane still glided through the sky, quiet, steady, serene. But inside his chest, the descent had already begun. The silence he once used like a weapon, commanding, smug, untouchable, was now the silence that surrounded him. Not reverence. Not awe. But the silence people reserve for watching a man unravel slowly, unwilling to accept the walls are closing in. He looked around. Eyes were no longer lowered. They were raised. Not in confrontation. In witness. That was the danger he never understood. Alicia Monroe had never needed to shout. She never had to plead her case. The moment he tried to belittle her in public, he made her visible. And when a black woman becomes visible in a space designed to erase her, history starts to listen. Cornelius adjusted his cufflinks. A petty gesture of control. He picked up his phone again, still no signal. He flagged down a flight attendant. Water, he snapped. Ice cold. The attendant nodded, moved. Obedience still existed. For now. But he saw the difference. There was no more fear in their eyes. Only caution. He was no longer a king. He was a liability. And Alicia Monroe, sat beside him like a storm calmly waiting its turn. You know what the problem is with your kind? He muttered, barely above a whisper, but loud enough for the air to catch it. You think if you walk into the room dressed like us, speak like us, sit beside us, you're us. Alicia turned. Slow, measured, and she smiled. That same unshakable smile that had followed him for the last hour, that had weathered insults, spills, performance, and threat. No, she said. I don't want to be you, Mr. Pratt. I want to replace you. He stiffened. It was the first crack in his composure that Alicia had truly seen, and she didn't look away. You want the truth? She asked, voice soft as dusk. I was taught to make men like you comfortable. To move softly. To defer. To smile without teeth. But then I realized the lie inside that lesson. You weren't comfortable because we were kind. You were comfortable because we were afraid. She leaned in now, but not to whisper. To clarify. I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Pratt. I outgrew you. Cornelius swallowed hard. The words didn't strike, they settled. Like dust over legacy. Like a verdict arriving decades late. Then, from the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making a brief announcement shortly. We ask all passengers to remain seated. That was it. A line in the air. A gathering of something. A moment collecting its weight. Cornelius chuckled, dry, thin. You've stirred up a crowd, Ms. Monroe. But don't mistake theater for power. Alicia tilted her head. Oh, I'm not mistaking anything, she said. You are. And just then, Laura, the young flight attendant, returned. Not alone this time. With her was the supervisor. And behind him, the co-pilot. Cornelius blinked. What now? He asked. But the certainty was gone from his voice. The supervisor addressed Alicia first. Ms. Monroe, the captain has asked if you'd be willing to step into the forward cabin for a brief word. Cornelius scoffed. Why? So she can complain about the seating? The service? Her feelings. But the supervisor ignored him. Alicia stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. Of course, she said simply. And as she walked down that narrow aisle, each passenger watched her, not with curiosity, but with respect. Cornelius sat there, suddenly aware of how quiet first class had become. The man who'd mocked. The man who'd spilled. The man who believed himself immune. Now I felt something unfamiliar sliding under his skin. Not guilt. Irrelevance. Because Alicia Monroe had changed the rules without raising her voice. Because now, the question wasn't whether she belonged in that seat. The question was why he still did. And outside, the night sky watched silently, as it always had, waiting for men like Cornelius to learn what it means to fall in a world they once believed was theirs alone. There are moments when the world becomes aware of itself. When all the little lies, polished and polite, collapse under the weight of a single truth. Cornelius Pratt felt that moment arrive. Not with thunder. Not with punishment. But with silence. Because silence, when it stops serving power, becomes the loudest sound in the world. He sat alone now, not physically, but spiritually. The murmurs in the cabin no longer served him. They studied him. The flight crew no longer obeyed him. They avoided him. And Alicia Monroe was no longer seated beside him. She had risen. She'd been escorted to the forward cabin by uniformed hands, but she hadn't been diminished. No. She walked as though the aisle was a hallway she'd paved herself. Cornelius could feel it. Something was moving. Something bigger than inconvenience, bigger than conflict. Something corporate. Something consequential. And for the first time, he was not in the loop. He checked his phone again. Still no signal. He flagged the lead flight attendant. "I want to speak to the captain." The man, gray-haired and cold-eyed, simply said, "The captain will address you shortly, sir." Sir. The word had changed flavor. Once an acknowledgement of authority, now a containment of it. Cornelius swallowed hard. The seat beside him, still warm from Alicia's presence, felt like a monument. And every glance from the other passengers felt like a verdict. One of them, the older woman from row 4, leaned toward the aisle and said loud enough for no one to deny, "I remember a time when men like him owned the sky. Now they just whimper when it stops answering to them." He turned to face her, his jaw clenched. "You don't know me." She met his gaze without flinching. "That's the problem. We all do." That struck deep, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Cornelius wasn't unique. He was familiar. And in being so, he became the symbol of everything that had gone unquestioned for far too long. Then the intercom cracked to life again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be making a brief acknowledgement before continuing with our journey." The captain's voice was slow, deliberate, like it had been chosen with lawyers present. "We are honored to have with us Ms. Alicia Monroe, newly appointed CEO of the merged Monroe Pratt Group." Gasps. Whispers. Then quiet again. Cornelius frozen. That name, his name, now tethered to hers. He didn't understand. He couldn't. Because men like Cornelius believed ownership was eternal. That the system would always protect them. That the company they built would never vote for someone who looked like her. But the vote had already been cast. The decision has already been made. He was no longer the head of the company. He was its relic. And Alicia Monroe wasn't just his replacement. She was the rebuke of his legacy. He stood up suddenly, unable to breathe. "This is insane. This is a mistake." Passengers turned. A young man across the aisle, the same one who had earlier challenged him, shook his head. "Sit down, Mr. Pratt. For once in your life, just listen." Cornelius didn't. He couldn't. Because this wasn't just about business. It was about identity. And nothing shatters a man faster than realizing the system he used to elevate himself has moved on, without him. Moments later, Alicia returned. She didn't gloat. She didn't scowl. She just walked past him, her footsteps soft but final. And in that quiet, Cornelius understood something he had never allowed himself to believe. Power is not inherited. It is taken. And Alicia Monroe hadn't just taken her seat. She had taken the sky. There is a kind of silence that no longer comforts a man. It corners him. It judges him. And it never, ever forgets. Cornelius Pratt sat in first class, but he was no longer in it. He could feel the betrayal in the air. Not from strangers, no. He never expected much from passengers. But from the crew. From the flight deck. From the very systems that once bent around his shadow. Now they stiffened when he spoke. They looked past him when he moved. And worst of all, his name was no longer said with reverence. It was shared. "Cornelius Pratt? The former CEO? Did you see her face? Calm like the sea, just before it swallows a city whole." Alicia Monroe had returned to her seat, not as a woman beside him, but as the woman above him. And she said nothing. That silence was no longer defensive. It was architectural. She had built something out of it. Cornelius tried to gather what scraps of ego he had left. He crossed his arms. He scowled. He muttered something about lawsuits. About slander. About the woke disease eating this country alive. But the room didn't rise. It no longer belonged to him. And as the attendants moved up the aisle with refreshed trays and filtered smiles, it became clear. He was not the man they were serving anymore. He flagged one down. Laura, the same one he had once snapped at like a waiter too slow at an expensive steakhouse. "I need to speak with the captain." Her eyes flicked to his, unreadable. "I'll let him know." She didn't bow. She didn't rush. She walked away, measured, as if the weight of his name had become weightless. Across the aisle, David Miller, the man who had stood up for Alicia hours earlier, shook his head. Not in mockery, but in prophecy. You don't see it, do you? Cornelius blinked. See what? David leaned in slightly. You think this is about her? It's about you. Always has been. Cornelius sneered. Don't lecture me. I built something. From scratch. Something she couldn't even dream of without men like me making space for her. David's smile was tired. Not amused. Just tired. That's the problem, Cornelius. You think the space belonged to you in the first place. He sat back. And Cornelius felt something snap. Not publicly, not dramatically. Something internal. A thread. A belief. A version of himself that had never been challenged. Until now. He looked at Alicia, still silent, still poised. Her presence was a reminder that the age of unchallenged men was dying, and she was writing its obituary at 35,000 feet. Then the intercom lit up again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Upon landing, we will be welcoming a representative from Carter Pratt Global Holdings on board to complete a routine transition audit. The words weren't violent. They were clean. Corporate. But to Cornelius, they rang like a hammer on glass. Alicia turned to him for the first time in over an hour. You always thought we were chasing the seat, she said softly. He stared, jaw twitching. She leaned in. But we were chasing the table. And now I'm at the head of it. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because what do you say when you've lived your life believing you were the architect of every room, only to realize you were the last to arrive? The cabin grew quiet again. But this silence didn't protect him. It exposed him. And as the wheels lowered toward the tarmac, Cornelius Pratt, for the first time, understood the finality of something black folks had always known. Power borrowed through oppression is never yours to keep. When the wheels touched ground, it wasn't the plane that jolted. It was him. Cornelius Pratt felt the shudder not in steel or sky, but in the hollowed core of his legacy. The aircraft rolled smooth over tarmac, but something inside him buckled. The world had changed midair. And now, the runway bore witness. Flight attendants moved quickly, methodically, but there was no eye contact. No bowed heads. No small talk. The kind of pleasantries men like Cornelius had grown used to absent. This wasn't hostility. It was clarity. Across the cabin, Alicia Monroe sat composed. Her hands folded over her lap. Her face is calm. Her power is silent, but complete. She had not shouted. She had not begged. She had not once told them who she was. Because she didn't need to. The plane came to a stop. The seatbelt light blinked off. And then came the voice one final time. Mr. Cornelius Pratt, please remain seated. A representative from the Carter Pratt Executive Board will be boarding shortly. He didn't move. He couldn't. The murmurs returned. But this time, they weren't murmurs of judgment. They were the hush that follows justice. The quiet before a reckoning is written down. He glanced at Alicia. For the first time, there was something in his eyes that hadn't lived there before. Not rage, not pride, fear. You planned this, he whispered. She turned slowly, her voice soft, not cruel. No. You provoked this. The doors opened. Two men in suits entered. Not police, not security, compliance. Corporate truth-bringers. The kind you can't bribe, can't shut down, can't charm. They stopped in front of him. Mr. Pratt, one of them said, voice cold as glass. You are hereby removed from all active duties within Carter Pratt Holdings. Your access has been revoked. Your transition exit will be supervised. Passengers turned in their seats, some watching without blinking. Others lowered their eyes, not in shame, but in recognition. They had seen men fall before. But never like this. Not with such elegance. Not at the hands of someone so calm, so black, so unbothered. Cornelius rose slowly. No one helped him. No one extended a hand. He looked at the crew, nothing. Looked to the aisle, only eyes. And Alicia? She didn't even turn her head. That, more than the paperwork, more than the titles, was the final blow. She had ended him without needing to look back. As he passed, one woman whispered, "That's the new boss." Another nodded. She didn't raise her voice once. And David Miller, still seated near the back, gave one small, satisfied nod. Outside, the sun was rising. And in the glass of the jet bridge, Cornelius caught a glimpse of himself, older than he remembered, smaller than he believed. A man once feared, now finished. Alicia stood only after he was gone. She didn't bask, didn't gloat. She simply walked, steady, deliberate, toward the front of the plane, where the captain now stood waiting. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside, because doors that once closed at her presence now opened at her arrival. Before stepping out, Alicia paused. She turned once to the cabin, not to the passengers, but to the moment. And with the grace of every woman who had ever been told not here, not now, not yet, she stepped into the light, not as a guest, but as the future. And for those who had doubted, dismissed, or degraded her, the lesson was clear. The sky does not belong to those who claim it the loudest. It belongs to those who rise in silence and change the air itself. The end.